Summer Lovin' happened so fast. You know every word. Your mom knows every word. And if you're honest, you've probably sung both parts at some point when nobody was watching. But behind the leather jackets, the pink satin, and that flying car ending nobody has ever been able to explain, lies a story most fans have never heard. Today, we're diving into 15 facts about Grease, from a casting disaster that almost gave us a completely different Sandy, to a dance floor where people were literally collapsing from the heat, to the one contractual clause that accidentally created the greatest karaoke anthem of all time. Stick around for the bonus fact at the end. It involves a man who was supposed to be Danny Zuko, and a decision that may be the most expensive career mistake in Hollywood history. Grease hit theaters in the summer of 1978 and became something nobody at Paramount had predicted, a cultural tidal wave. Made for just $6 million, it went on to earn $396 million worldwide, 66 times its budget. It dethroned The Sound of Music as the highest-grossing musical ever made, and for nearly 40 years, no other live-action musical could touch it at the domestic box office. John Travolta, Olivia Newton-John, Stockard Channing, a soundtrack that still plays in every supermarket, every karaoke bar, and every school musical on Earth. Grease wasn't just a film. It was the version of the 1950s that an entire generation decided to believe in. And the story behind it is messier, stranger, and far more fascinating than anything that ends up on screen. Let's get into it. Fact 1. The students of Rydell High, who were old enough to pay taxes. Everyone who watched Grease in 1978 believed they were watching teenagers. The kind of carefree, reckless, 17-year-old energy that makes high school look like the best years of your life. Here's the thing. They weren't teenagers, not even close. Hollywood in the late 70s wasn't casting for authenticity. They were casting for performers who could sing, dance, hit their marks, and survive a grueling production schedule without a chaperone. So Grease didn't hire teens. They hired professionals who could squeeze into Letterman jackets. Stockard Channing, who played the supposedly 17-year-old Rizzo, was 33 years old on set, nearly double the age of her character. But here's why it works. That world-weary confidence, that sharp-tongued cynicism, that unmistakable "I've seen some things" energy that makes Rizzo who she is, you cannot fake that at 17. Channing didn't have to. Jamie Donnelly, who played Jan, was 30 and already going gray. The crew filled in her roots with black crayon every single morning to keep her looking like she belonged in homeroom rather than a parent-teacher conference. Even the leads weren't quite who they appeared. Travolta was 23, Olivia Newton-John was 29, and so worried about looking too old that she insisted on a screen test before signing, just to make sure Sandy wouldn't read as someone who had already been through a mortgage. Grease was never really about high school. It was high school as remembered 10 years later, after life had started getting complicated. And that's exactly why it works. Fact 2. The original stage musical of Grease didn't have a standout ballad for Sandy. That's not how the show was built. Sandy wasn't a singer who got her moment. She was part of an ensemble. But Olivia Newton-John was a recording artist first, and her contract made one thing absolutely clear. If she was going to carry this film, she needed a solo. The problem? The song didn't exist yet. Halfway through production, her longtime producer, John Farrar, finally delivered. He wrote what felt like a classic 1950s torch ballad, full of longing, built around heartbreak, but polished with a late 70s pop sheen. Exactly what Sandy needed. By the time the track was ready to film, principal photography had already wrapped. The entire cast had scattered to other projects, so Olivia came back alone to shoot the scene. That's why Sandy is completely by herself in the backyard. Not because the script demanded solitude, because the schedule did. Even her look had to be faked. Hair and makeup worked to recreate Sandy's earlier appearance. But if you look closely, the details don't quite match the summer night sequence. That contractually obligated song became the film's emotional core. Hopelessly Devoted to You earned the only Academy Award nomination Grease ever received. It shot up the charts and helped transform Olivia Newton-John into a full-blown crossover superstar. And today, it's so essential to the story that modern stage revivals include it, even though it was never part of the original show. Fact 3. The animated opening of Grease, bubbly, colorful, disco-infused, looks like it belongs to a completely different film. That's because it kind of does. Before John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John ever stepped on a soundstage, the first person to acquire the rights to Grease was Ralph Bakshi. If that name doesn't mean anything to you, his filmography will. Fritz the Cat, the first animated feature to earn an X rating in the United States. Bakshi didn't make family entertainment. He made animated films for adults who probably shouldn't have been watching cartoons. His vision for Grease matched that energy exactly. Dark, adult-oriented, and fully animated. When Bakshi's team was asked how the story would end, they had an answer nobody expected. Danny Zuko takes his own life. Co-creator Jim Jacobs later recalled that he and his writing partner were kicking each other under the table during the pitch meeting. Bakshi's option on the rights eventually lapsed in 1976. Producer Alan Carr stepped in, paid $200,000 of his own money, and turned Grease into the PG-rated musical we all know. But Bakshi never let go of the concept. In 1982, he released Hey Good Lookin', an animated film set in the 1950s, featuring leather jackets, greaser gangs, and a main character who looks suspiciously familiar. The cheerful animated opening we actually got was created by an entirely different studio, but every time those cartoon T-birds appear on screen, there's a parallel universe where the story ends very differently. Fact 4. Greased Lightning feels inseparable from Danny Zuko. The swagger, the choreography, the way Travolta owns every second of it. It's impossible to imagine anyone else leading that number. But in the original Broadway musical and in the early plans for the film, Greased Lightning belonged to Kenickie, his car, his dream, his big moment. The song was written as pure working-class bravado, designed to give Jeff Conaway his spotlight. Here's the backstory that makes it even sharper. Conaway had actually played Danny Zuko on Broadway. He started as an understudy and eventually took over the lead role. When the film was made, he stepped aside so Travolta could have the part and settled for the supporting role instead, but at least he'd still have the showstopper. Then John Travolta saw the number for what it was, the high-energy sequence everyone would remember, and wanted it. Director Randall Kleiser felt it was only right to ask Conaway if he'd be willing to give it up. Conaway initially refused. Eventually, he gave in, so the man who played Danny on Broadway had to watch his biggest song get handed to someone else, and the hits kept coming. During the Greased Lightning shoot, Conaway was accidentally dropped by other cast members and injured his back. Doctors prescribed painkillers. That injury sparked an addiction that followed him for the rest of his life. On screen, Travolta drove that song straight into movie legend. Off screen, Conaway paid for it in ways nobody saw coming. Fact 5. The Pink Ladies jackets that almost looked completely different. The Pink Ladies jackets are seared into pop culture. Bright, bold, unmistakably pink satin. One look and you know exactly which side you're on. But they almost didn't exist in that form. Costume designer Albert Wolski originally created more understated outfits for the film, toned down. Director Randall Kleiser wasn't having it. He wanted more color, more vibrance. He wanted a musical that looked like a jukebox on fire. So Wolski went back to the drawing board. He threw the period rulebook out the window and went full kaleidoscope. Bold colors, flattering silhouettes, and those pink satin jackets. The goal was never realism. Grease was never supposed to look like an actual 1950s high school. It was supposed to look like the version of the 50s you'd dream up after too many root beer floats. Not how it was, how it felt. 45 years later, you still can't throw a costume party without someone walking through the door in pink satin with their name stitched across the back. Sometimes going too far is exactly the right distance. Fact 6. The National Bandstand sequence, all that bright, electric, crowd-pleasing energy, was filmed at Huntington Park High School in the middle of a California summer. The gym had no air conditioning. Then they added industrial production lights, dozens of bodies in non-breathable costumes, thick crinolines, wool suits, and enough hairspray to punch a hole in the ozone. Temperatures on the floor reportedly hit 116 degrees, and there was a slaughterhouse nearby. Olivia Newton-John later described how the smell from the meat processing plant would drift in whenever the windows were opened for relief. The crew had a choice: keep the windows shut and slowly roast, or open them and work through the smell. They rotated between both options and hated every version. This wasn't a one-day shoot. The sequence took 5 full days to film. Pompadours started collapsing. Makeup ran. Several cast members had to be pulled off the floor from heat exhaustion. Michael Tucci, who played Sonny, reportedly ended up in the hospital for dehydration. Between takes, actors would lie flat on the gym floor, just trying to recover enough to stand up again. So the next time you watch Danny and Cha-Cha tear up the dance floor and everyone looks electric and alive, What you're actually seeing is people fighting through 116-degree heat, trying not to pass out, while a slaughterhouse operates next door. That's not movie magic, that's survival. Fact 7. The drag race looks incredible. 2 cars screaming down concrete, Danny behind the wheel, the whole gang cheering like it's the greatest moment of their lives. What the cameras didn't show was what was sitting in the Los Angeles River beneath those wheels. The LA River is not a scenic location. It's a concrete drainage channel that collects runoff from half the city. By the time the grease crew arrived, whatever was sitting in that riverbed had been baking under the California sun for weeks, stagnant, warm, a bacterial soup in a concrete bowl. Every time greased lightning or Hell's Chariot tore down that channel, contaminated water sprayed across the cast, the crew, and anyone standing within range. Nobody gave it much thought until they all started getting sick. Director Randall Kleiser had been walking around barefoot because of the heat. He cut his foot and kept working. The next day, he had a 101-degree fever and directed the diner scenes in a haze, barely aware of what was happening around him. Then there was Annette Charles, Cha-Cha. She filmed her flag-waving moment in pure agony. She had checked herself out of the hospital mid-testing just to make it to set. Between takes, she leaned against the cars because standing on her own wasn't possible. She white-knuckled her way through the scene, got the shot, went straight back to the hospital that night, where doctors discovered an ectopic pregnancy and rushed her into emergency surgery. She didn't know what was wrong. She just knew she had to finish the scene. On screen, pure greaser glory. Behind the camera, a director with a fever, an actress hours from the operating table, and a river of sludge nobody should have been standing in. Fact 8. The Coca-Cola cover-up hiding in every diner scene. If you've ever noticed the weirdly blurry posters in the diner sequences, you weren't imagining things. That's not a film glitch. That's corporate damage control. When the diner set was dressed for production, Coca-Cola signs ended up plastered across the walls. Nobody flagged it as a problem until they saw the footage. Then someone remembered that producer Alan Carr had already signed a promotional deal with Pepsi. Reshooting was out of the question. Too expensive, too time-consuming. So they went with the next option: blur it out. This was pre-digital. No Adobe After Effects, no clean compositing. To erase Coca-Cola from the film, the studio had to use optical mats. Old school effects work applied directly to the film negative. It was clunky, it was obvious, and they couldn't even fix all of it. There's a red Coke cooler in the diner that was too prominent to alter convincingly, so they left it. Kleiser later admitted they just had to hope Pepsi wouldn't notice. The 40th anniversary release finally attempted to address it, digitally replacing the blurred posters with actual Pepsi logos. But the rotoscoping is still visible if you know where to look. 40 years later, the cola wars are still playing out in the background of a malt shop scene. Fact 9. 20 minutes to choreograph one of the most famous finales in movie musical history. The carnival finale of Grease looks like barely controlled chaos. The funhouse, the rides, Danny and Sandy finally getting their act together, everyone dancing like the world is ending in the best possible way. The barely controlled part is doing more work than you'd think. Producer Alan Carr rented an actual traveling carnival and dropped it on the football field at John Marshall High School, a real midway. Real rides. The cast arrived to work and found a full fairground waiting for them. But here's the problem. The song they were about to perform didn't exist until they were standing on set. You're the One That I Want, the song that's been in your head since the opening of this video, arrived so late that choreographer Pat Birch had approximately 20 minutes to throw together the entire funhouse sequence. 20 minutes. For one of the most recognizable dance numbers in the history of the movie musical. The cast heard the song for the first time right there on set, which means all that excitement and energy you see on their faces, that's real. They had no idea what was coming, and poor Eddie Deason, the beloved nerd Eugene, was strapped into a spinning carnival ride for take after take after take. When they finally got the shot, he staggered off, found a nearby patch of grass, and immediately threw up. When you watch that finale and everyone looks like they're running on pure adrenaline and joy, it's because they kind of were. Fact 10. The It Girls who almost became Sandy, and why they all said no. Sandy Olsen feels so perfectly cast that it seems inevitable. But before Olivia Newton-John, the producers chased virtually every major actress of the era, and each one nearly sent the film in a completely different direction. Maria Osmond was high on the list. In the late 70s, she was America's wholesome sweetheart, an obvious choice for Sandy, but she turned it down. And her reason was unusually clear-headed. She hated the ending. She believed Sandy transforming herself for Danny sent the wrong message to young girls. The guy should change for the girl, not the other way around. If she'd said yes, Grease might have been a much cleaner, more family-friendly musical with a very different final act. Then there was Carrie Fisher. Director Randall Kleiser had been a college roommate of George Lucas, and while Lucas was busy editing a small science fiction film called Star Wars, Kleiser stopped by to look at some footage hoping Princess Leia might work as his Sandy. He later admitted he couldn't tell much from what he saw. All he could really make out was her hair. Olivia Newton-John came with her own complication. Even after she signed on, she couldn't nail an American accent. The solution was elegant. Rather than recast, the filmmakers simply rewrote the character. Sandy Dombrowski, the American small-town girl, became Sandy Olsen, an Australian transfer student. Problem solved. And John Travolta, who had fought hard for Olivia from the start, finally got his co-star. Fact 11. The flying car ending that nobody has ever been able to explain. Most movie couples get a kiss at the end, maybe a slow dance. Danny and Sandy get into a convertible and fly away into the sky. No explanation, no warning. Just a car, two people, and the complete suspension of every known law of physics. Director Randall Kleiser has been asked about this moment for decades. His answer has essentially been a shrug. The flying car wasn't in the stage play. The original musical ends at the Burger Palace. Feet firmly on the ground, no liftoff, just a regular happy ending. The film had other ideas. The internet, being the internet, eventually generated a theory. The whole movie is Sandy's dying hallucination. She nearly drowned at the beach at the beginning of the story. Danny even brags about saving her life in summer nights, and everything after that is a fantasy as she slips away. The flying car is Sandy ascending to heaven. The too perfect ending is the last thing her mind creates. Grease co-creator Jim Jacobs shut that down emphatically. He told reporters the person who came up with that theory must have been on acid. Sandy was very much alive. Olivia Newton-John thought the whole thing was hilarious and joked that it would make Grease the first zombie musical. So no, the car isn't symbolic, it's not metaphorical, it's just gloriously, unapologetically weird. And in a film where a mechanic's garage breaks into a choreographed fantasy sequence and Frankie Avalon floats down from the clouds to give beauty school advice, a flying car is just another Tuesday. Fact 12. The suit that went to war over a cola sign, Elvis Presley was considered for the role of Teen Angel, the glittering, heavenly advisor who descends to counsel Frenchie in Beauty School Dropout. Think about what that would have meant. Elvis, the man whose entire swagger Danny Zuko spent the film trying to imitate, playing a literal angel offering life guidance to a beauty school dropout. By 1977, his health was declining. For whatever reason, the role feeling too small, the involvement of his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, the timing, he passed. Then came the surreal twist. According to director Randall Kleiser, the news of Elvis's death hit the set on the exact same day they were filming the slumber party scene in which Rizzo sings, "Elvis, Elvis, let me be. Keep that pelvis far from me." The crew was completely creeped out. The whole set went quiet. After Elvis passed on both the role and then life itself, producers turned to Frankie Avalon, the squeaky clean beach movie heartthrob of the early 60s. In the context of Grease's sun-drenched, idealized version of the 50s and 60s, he was actually a perfect fit. But every time that scene plays, there's a ghost in it. The song is about Elvis. The timing was impossible, and the man who was first offered the part died the same week they filmed the song, making fun of him. Fact 13. The vintage pants held together by thread and willpower. Sandy's transformation in the final scene, walking out in those high-waisted black pants, confident, commanding, untouchable, is one of the most iconic costume moments in cinema history. What you don't see is that Olivia Newton-John was essentially vacuum sealed into those trousers for the duration of every take, and one bathroom break could have shut down the entire production. The pants were not made for the film. They were vintage, actually from the 1950s, tracked down by costume designer Albert Walski because he wanted to stay true to the era. There was only one pair, no backups, no doubles. As Olivia later put it, one rip and disaster. When she first tried them on, the zipper was already broken, dead. Walski didn't want to risk damaging the vintage fabric by replacing it, so the costume department came up with a solution. They sewed her into the pants every single morning. Once she was stitched in, that was it. No comfortable sitting, no bending over. Bathroom breaks required the crew to carefully unpick the stitching, help her out, and then sew her back in again. Olivia later joked that it limited her drinking and eating because the whole process had to be reversed and repeated. She danced anyway. Every kick, every spin, every strut. knowing those 25-year-old seams could give out at any moment. In 2019, Olivia auctioned the full outfit to raise money for her cancer wellness center. The leather jacket alone sold for $243,200. The pants, broken zipper still intact, went for $162,500 to Sarah Blakely, the founder of Spanx, who called Olivia the OG of black leggings and had them framed and hung in the Spanx headquarters. Fact 14. The $6 million film that dethroned The Sound of Music. When Grease opened in the summer of 1978, Paramount had modest expectations. They had made a safe, mid-budget teen musical for $6 million. They hoped for a solid return. What they got was something else entirely. Grease became the highest-grossing film of 1978, beating out Superman and Jaws 2. Then it kept going. It shattered The Sound of Music's 13-year reign as the highest-grossing musical ever made. In the United States, it claimed the throne as the highest-grossing live-action musical, a title it would defend for nearly 40 years. Think about what that means. Through the entire 1980s, through the 90s, through the 2000s, decades of big-budget musicals swinging for the fences. Moulin Rouge, Chicago, Les Miserables, La La Land. None of them could dislodge Danny and Sandy from their domestic throne. It wasn't until 2017, when Disney released Beauty and the Beast, that Grease finally lost the crown at the US box office. Then Wicked dethroned that in 2024. The film, made for $6 million, went on to earn $396 million worldwide. That's 66 times its budget. Made in the same era as Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and it outran them both at the yearly box office. Critics called it pleasant and plastic. Teenagers didn't care. They showed up in droves, and they kept showing up. Fact 15. The romance nobody asked for, and the tricks that hid it. After the first test screenings of Grease, the notes from audiences and Paramount executives came back with one consistent message: needs more romance. So even though principal photography had wrapped months earlier and everyone had moved on to other projects, the cast and crew were called back for reshoots. 2 scenes were added specifically to heat up the chemistry between Maverick and Charlie. Between Danny and Sandy, the flirtatious elevator encounter, and the blue-lit love scene set to Take My Breath Away. No, wait, Berlin, different movie. The love scene set to You're the One That I Want. No, that's the finale. The love scene set to Hopelessly Devoted. That's the solo, not the... The point is, 2 scenes were added late, the elevator scene and the blue-lit bedroom sequence, both designed to give audiences the slow-burn romance they wanted. But there was a problem nobody had anticipated: Kelly McGillis. Wait, wrong film again. Olivia Newton-John had already moved on. Her hair was different. Travolta's hair was longer. They didn't look the way they had during the original shoot. Director Randall Kleiser improvised. Olivia wears a baseball cap in the elevator scene, and the love scene was flooded with deep blue lighting, specifically to hide the fact that the 2 leads no longer looked quite the same as they had months earlier. It worked. Audiences got exactly the romance they were asking for, and nobody watching in the theater had the faintest idea they were looking at a last-minute fix held together by a hat and a lighting gel. The detail you see so clearly, that blue, that wasn't mood, that was a cover story. Bonus fact. And now the bonus I've been saving for last. This one involves a man, an orange juice, and what might be the most expensive decision in Hollywood career history. In 1977, Henry Winkler was one of the most recognizable faces on American television. His character, Arthur Fonzie Fonzarelli on Happy Days, was the defining image of 1950s cool. The leather jacket, the motorcycle, the thumb-up swagger that had made him a cultural icon. When the producers of Grease came calling, they were handing him the obvious next step: Danny Zuko, the coolest guy at Rydell High. Winkler said no, flat out. He was terrified of being typecast. He was already the leather-jacketed, motorcycle-riding cool guy every week on ABC. Taking Danny would have cemented that image permanently, leaving no room to become anything else. That refusal opened the door for a young actor just starting to break through on Welcome Back, Kotter, John Travolta. He'd already played Tony in the touring stage production of Grease. He could sing, he could move. His mother owned a dance studio, and by the time he'd finished Saturday Night Fever, released just months before Grease, He had trained with top choreographers until his footwork was bulletproof. Winkler later acknowledged the mistake openly. He summed it up in a single perfect line. He went home and had an orange juice, while Travolta went home and bought a plane. He also admitted, with characteristic honesty, that Travolta was simply the better fit, partly because Winkler genuinely couldn't sing, but the what if still hangs in the air. If Winkler had said yes, we might have gotten a glorified Happy Days movie with a different title. Instead, we got John Travolta, one of the most iconic performances in the history of the movie musical, and a film that 396 million people paid to see, all because one man decided he didn't want to be typecast and went home for an orange juice.